The deep dive is back, and today we're diving into a single, often misunderstood doctrine that is absolutely central to understanding the inner workings of Islamic law. We are talking about nask, the concept of abrogation.
It's one of the most intellectually challenging and frequently criticized doctrines in Islamic jurisprudence. For you, the listener, understanding nask is really a shortcut to seeing how scholars reconcile an eternal, perfect, divine scripture, the Quran, with the reality of legal change over time.
Exactly. We've collected sources spanning classical Sunni, Shia, and modern interpretations, and our mission is, well, it's simple: to provide a structured, impartial overview of how this works, how critics attack it, and how the mainstream scholarly tradition responds.
Yeah, so let's start with a precise definition. Nask is formally defined as the lifting of a legal ruling by a subsequent legal ruling from the lawgiver, meaning God. And the critical fact check here, which often gets lost, is that nask almost always refers to the legal ruling being superseded, not the text itself being erased. Text, it stays preserved in the Quran.
Okay, that distinction is essential. But let's not shy away from the core theological challenge. You hear critics ask, if God is all-knowing and the revelation is perfect, why reveal a command only to cancel it later? Doesn't that imply a change in divine will? Or, I don't know, that the first ruling was an error that needed fixing?
That is the central philosophical knot that classical scholars had to untangle. And they did so by making a really profound distinction. Their core defense is this: nask is not a change in God's eternal knowledge. God knew from eternity that different rulings would apply at different stages. The change is in the subject's situation, or the stage of the law itself.
So if God's knowledge is a constant, the law is being phased in, staged, not corrected.
Precisely. To make this clear, scholars needed a powerful analogy, and this is where the famous example from figures like Al-Ghazali and Al-Shafi'i comes in: the doctor.
Let's walk through that. How does the doctor analogy defend divine consistency?
Okay, so think of a patient with a severe illness. The doctor, who has perfect medical knowledge, first prescribes a really harsh medicine. It's necessary for that initial crisis. But later, as the patient gets better, the doctor abrogates the powerful drug and replaces it with, say, a gentler tonic.
A completely different prescription.
Yes. But did the doctor's knowledge change? No. The doctor knew from the start that the first prescription was temporary. The change was in the patient's condition, not the doctor's plan. The purpose, the cure, is constant. The method changes.
That makes the process sound completely rational. But if the text remains, doesn't that cause confusion? How do you know which verse is active?
And that's exactly why the science of nask became so crucial. It wasn't about divine confusion, it was about human understanding. Scholars had to systematize the chronological order to figure out what came first.
Before we move on, I want to touch on something you highlighted in the sources, the Shia perspective.
Right, the concept of bada. So, the majority view affirms God's knowledge is eternally fixed. The Shia tradition maintains that while God's absolute will is unchanging, apparent change bada only manifests in our world, the created realm. It's about how we as limited humans perceive the law unfolding over time without ever suggesting God learned something new.
Understood. Now, if we accept the staging of the law, that leads us right into the second key defense.
Tadarruj. Tadarruj. It means gradualism, or pedagogy. Critics say, temporary verses mean the revelation was incomplete, but the scholarly defense is that perfection here means suitability for purpose at each stage. It was delivered sequentially to match the community's maturity.
And this is where we need that concrete example. Give us the gold standard case that illustrates this: the prohibition of alcohol.
It's the perfect illustration. It shows the law adjusting to a deeply ingrained social practice, and it unfolds in 4 distinct stages.
Okay, so stage 1 was early Mecca.
Right. No specific prohibition. The focus was just on establishing monotheism. Stage 2 in the Quran is a kind of moral reckoning. It says alcohol has benefits, but the sin is greater than the benefit. It's a strong warning, but it's not a ban yet.
Just a severe discouragement, giving people time to process.
Exactly. Then stage 3 introduces a major restriction: prohibition before prayer. Do not approach prayer while intoxicated. Since Muslims pray 5 times a day, this basically shut down consumption.
It makes daytime drinking pretty much impossible.
Correct. So the community had been prepared. Then finally, stage 4 delivered the total permanent prohibition. This whole process avoided the chaos an immediate ban would have caused. It's presented as divine wisdom.
That progression makes incredible sense socially. But let's go back to the text. Why keep the canceled verses in the Quran? Why not just remove them?
Well, there are 3 main reasons, often tied to the idea of tabud. First, Spiritual reward. Reciting any word of the Quran, even an abrogated one, carries a reward. Second, it's a historical record. It shows God's gradual mercy. And third, it's for legal methodology. It gives scholars the data to understand Nask itself.
So, an earlier ruling isn't wrong when the final one arrives. It was necessary for its time. Like, a foundation isn't incomplete just because the roof is added later.
It was the perfect foundation for the perfect final structure. That's the pedagogical defense in a nutshell.
Okay, now we have to move to the toughest critique, the moral and political one. Critics point to a shift from peaceful Meccan verses like no compulsion in religion to later Mednan verses on warfare, like the famous sword verse. Isn't this, they ask, a moral regression driven by political power?
That's a critical challenge, and it requires careful contextualization. Mainstream scholars argue emphatically that this is not moral decline. It is strategic legislation for a maturing community facing different circumstances.
Unpack that distinction for us.
During the Meccan phase, the community was a persecuted minority. They were told to endure. When they established a state in Medina, they faced existential threats, aggression, treaty breakers. So the law moved from guiding survival to establishing justice and defense.
So the argument is that verses on warfare are context-specific. They're responses to active hostility, not a blanket cancellation of peace.
Exactly. The majority view is that a principle like no compulsion remains an overarching moral tenet. A verse like 9.5 is treated as specific instructions for specific treaty breakers in a particular campaign. It doesn't just cancel everything that came before.
But this brings us to the danger of selective application. Extremist groups have weaponized Nask, claiming the sword verse cancels all peaceful verses. How does mainstream scholarship shut that down?
By demanding adherence to strict legal methodology, usul al-fi. Extremists ignore two things. First, the need for clear contradiction and chronology. But more importantly, they ignore the overarching moral objectives, the maqasid al-sharia.
And what does that term maqasid al-sharia mean in practice?
It means the higher goals of Islamic law, preserving life, intellect, religion, property. A ruling, even if it abrogates another, cannot violate these universal moral objectives. So if an interpretation of Nask leads to wanton killing, it violates the maqasid and is illegitimate.
That provides a powerful internal check. So you have an internal moral core, the thawabit like justice, and then the time-bound applications, the mutagayyirat. The application can change, but the objective doesn't.
That distinction is the backbone of mature Islamic legal theory.
Let's pivot to the historical critiques. Nask is often linked to allegations of textual corruption. Two stories always come up: the Satanic verses and the scribe Abdullah ibn Sa'd.
On the Satanic verses, the overwhelming scholarly consensus, Sunni and Shia, is that the narration is historically weak or just fabricated. It doesn't meet the standards for authenticity.
And the theological defense.
Theologically, the idea of Nask, or God's immediate correction, is seen as the protection mechanism. If any falsehood were introduced, the divine promise of preservation would ensure it was immediately rejected.
And the scribe, Abdullah ibn Sa'd, the claim that he tried to alter revelations.
Mainstream scholarship rejects that he successfully corrupted anything. The preservation mechanisms were just too robust. You had mass memorization, tawatur by thousands of people, constant recitation, the prophet's own review. It was a functioning, multi-layered system of checks and balances.
And the community would have noticed these changes firsthand. I mean, it must have been a shock when the direction of prayer, the Qibla, suddenly shifted from Jerusalem to Mecca.
It was a massive psychological adjustment, yes, but they understood it as a direct command. They lived through these shifts, the Qibla, the alcohol stages.
Right.
Scholars later just formalized those observations into the science of Nask. They didn't invent the changes, they classified them.
Okay, now that we've covered the defenses, let's turn to legal application. Because Nask is not a monolithic concept, is it? It varies across the schools.
Not at all. The differences show how complex interpretation is. Take the Shafi'i school. They're very strict. Imam al-Shafi'i insisted only the Quran can abrogate the Quran, so they accept fewer cases of abrogation overall.
So, in their view, the Quran is its own sphere of authority. How does that compare to the Hanafis?
The Hanafi school is traditionally more flexible. They often accept that a mutawatir sunnah, a widely verified prophetic practice, can abrogate a Quranic ruling. It gives the sunnah a greater role in the final legal outcome.
That's a fundamental difference. What about the Jafari scholars, the main Shia school?
They affirm Nask, but with very tight criteria. A key difference is their strong rejection of something called nask al-tilawa.
Wait, hold on. We need to pause on that term. Nask al-tilawa? What is that?
It's a very contested idea, accepted by some Sunni scholars, that a verse's legal ruling is abrogated, and the text of the verse itself is also removed from the Quran. So the ruling is gone, and the words are gone.
That sounds like it could easily fuel the textual corruption critique we just talked about.
It does, which is why Jafari scholars largely reject it. They rely heavily on the guidance of the imams to contextualize verses, which reduces the need for explicit abrogation in the first place.
It seems like the overall trend now, across all the schools, is to drastically reduce the number of accepted cases.
Definitely. Classical counts varied wildly, from under 20 to over 200. But the modern trend is to minimize the count. They prefer to reclassify verses as being context-specific or conditional, rather than truly canceled. It makes the text feel more internally consistent.
So what does this deep dive ultimately mean for us? The key takeaway seems to be that Nask isn't divine inconsistency. It's a highly complex legal methodology showing divine wisdom in guiding a community over 23 years.
That's the crux of it. It's a mechanism classical scholars use to explain the dynamic nature of early Islamic law, emphasizing pedagogy and mercy, not divine error.
And as we end, given that this debate is still so active, what should we be left thinking about?
The debate over Nask continues to shape modern Islamic thought. Given the historical attempts to interpret verses to fit political needs, what responsibility falls on the contemporary believer and scholar today? How do they ensure the law, even when referencing these historical rulings, always aligns with those overarching eternal moral objectives, the mislead of justice, mercy, and welfare that all schools agree are unchanging? That tension between the temporary application and the eternal goal, that's the challenge that remains.